Hey guys, welcome to episode 161 of Stand Up. Joining me today, NPR education and parenting reporter, the great Anya Kamenetz, and nature writer and professor David Gessner will talk to us about Yosemite and other things. I'm Pete Dominick. It's time to stand up with me right now. Hey guys, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for joining me. I have two awesome guests that I'm about to share my conversations I had with you. That's what we do every day here on the podcast. I try to find the smartest people I can find and bring them on the show. And I want to interview more of you for the show. I want to talk with you about where you live and what your struggles are and what your triumphs are and what inspires you and what scares you. So I'd love to have you join me in one of these conversations. So if you're interested and you want to talk, by all means, reach out. standupwithpete@gmail.com. And if you're a subscriber to the podcast, then thank you very much. You can go to patreon.com/Pete Dominick and join me in the Zoom hangouts that we had. We did one last night, or I should say we just finished it. I'm recording this on Thursday night, but I like to try to pretend that it's being done like the day of that you listen to it, not that you listen to it on the day that it drops. Anyway, just got done with the Zoom hangout. Almost 70 people were there, and we're up to almost 700 subscribers. 70 of you joined me, and there's thousands of listeners. I'd love to see more of you in there. It's even if you don't talk, even if you don't weigh in, it's really comforting to see these people from all over the country, from different backgrounds and walks of life, sharing their hopes and dreams and fears and everything. It's always a fun hang, and I had a lot of fun. We had a lot of laughs, as always. And usually, I'm trying to get special guests to join us in there. Didn't have anybody on Thursday night, but it was fine because we had a great conversation. A whole bunch of people weighing in. So please, by all means, subscribe to the podcast, join this community, and we're just going to keep growing it and supporting each other because, as I say at the end of the show and now today at the beginning of the show, you're not alone. You aren't. There are other people that are experiencing what you're experiencing in some way. Not exactly what you're dealing with, but we're here together. We're going through this. It's a crazy time that we didn't expect to have to deal with, but it is what it is, as the president says. So bad, so terrible. It is where we are, and we're going to continue trying to plow through it together. So I hope that you'll join up and be a part of the community is what I'm trying to say. All right. So I don't really have anything to say about the news today. I didn't really pay that much attention to it. Some days you just got to look away from it. I did watch my share of anti-mask people getting either beat up or yelled at in public, but that was about it. It was a lot going on today. That's all I can say. And I had a great conversation with Anya Kamenetz. She is a reporter at NPR. And she's an awesome reporter. She does great work. I've known her for a long time. She's been on the show a bunch of times. We did a joint thing in the Aspen Ideas Fest a couple of years ago, and I think she's just one of the best. She reports on education in a really effective way. She's got an awesome book, which you should absolutely go buy if you're a parent especially. It's now out in paperback. It's called The Art of Screen Time, How Your Family Can Balance Digital Media and Real Life. She also has a newsletter, and all of this about her and all my guests are in the show notes, wherever you're listening to the podcast or if you're a subscriber on Patreon. We had an awesome conversation, and she taught me a lot of what I think I need to ask and what I need to know about sending my kids back to school, and I'm happy to share that with you coming up. Also, David Gessner. I've never talked to David, but I've been reading his stuff for a while, and he's got a new book out about America's wilderness, the American West, and David is a prolific writer and professor of creative writing, and I had an awesome conversation with him as well. So that is coming up after my conversation with Anya Kamenetz, which I am going to start right now. Okay, so there's Anya Kamenetz. Anya, I am so excited to have you joining me. You've been doing excellent reporting for NPR on all things back to school. Congratulations on the paperback release of your book. And how are you doing, real quick, with your kids? Because you're pulling back the curtain a little bit in your recent New York Times piece as well.
Yeah. So I'm here in New York, and we're doing pretty well, fingers crossed, as far as the virus. So my daughter's preschool opened up a few weeks ago, and it's amazing. They even do extended day. So it's really a game changer for us. My 8-year-old is home right now. We're going to do a week at the beach, and then she's going to start up online school. And we're kind of just feeling out, the options as far as socially distanced play dates. And there's a couple of, I've always been curious about unschooling, unschooling.
No.
So it's like a philosophy where basically you're trying to bring out the kids' motivation and their self-direction. And you really are offering them a lot of prompts, but not directives. And there's a few local organizations that have done this. And there's one that had a summer program that she signed up for that she really liked. And I have a good friend, Gabor Tully, who has a whole school that's built around this in California. And he did a TED Talk. It's called 50 Dangerous Things You Should Let Your Children Do. So he's very focused on just building, a lot of building, making, tinkering.
Is it like an aptitude test of some sort? Like these are the things they're interested in or have a passion for as well? Or am I?
It's all of that. I mean, it's not any kind of test. It's really about if you could do anything you wanted, how do you even discover what you want? And there's something very kind of zen about it.
It's called unschooling because school doesn't give you that option. School just, here's the 5 subjects. This is what we're teaching, or? Well,
schooling, it's a little more insidious than that. So one of the best books I ever read when I started doing education work is called Deschooling Society. And it's by Ivan Illich. It was written in 1971, and he was a radical priest who went down to Central America to teach, basically to teach peasants how to read, but he taught them how to read by showing them, asking them what words they wanted to know, basically. And they wanted to know words that helped them in their Marxist organizing, right? So it was what if we actually use learning to empower people rather than what the structures of learning do, which is, in this extreme rendering, they take away people's dignity, they make people feel ignorant, make people feel like they don't have any answers, and only the person at the front of the room has the answers.
It's fascinating. What's the name of the book again?
Called Deschooling Society.
It's really good.
It's really good. And once you start to look at it, you're okay, we live in this society. It has these kinds of institutions. It has and Foucault talks about this too, there's hospitals, there's prisons, and there's schools, which are processing institutions. They're holding institutions. They're institutions where the people that run the institution have all the power. And then you have to go there and do the thing that they tell you to do. And they're not there to necessarily, we have a lot of different, it's just one lens. Education just takes so many overlapping lenses. Yeah. But, I wrote this book about standardized testing, the test. And it kind of takes of this philosophy, which is what are these standardizations for? Are they for you? When you take the test, a state test or SAT, is it for you? No.
Definitely wasn't. It definitely wasn't for me. I'll tell you that right now.
It's for the hierarchy. Everybody, even the people who do good at that game, ultimately it's not your game. The house always wins,
Well, is that along the lines of just the idea that school in general and society in general, at least, I don't know if I want to say America, it crafts you into being a contributing member of society, maybe a drone or worker bee, if you want to be more pejorative, as opposed to allowing you to pursue any number of different paths that you might have had you not had that top-down curriculum and testing.
Again, I feel that's a lens, and I think it's a really crucial one. I went to a lot of good schools, and I know that there's great things happening at schools. Sure. And even if you look at the benign version of that is, okay, schools create productive, innovative members of society, or schools create, exemplary citizens, or without a school, how do we have a place that people come together from all walks of life and actually, learn that they live in a society? I believe in society. I don't think everything about society, now that it's breaking apart, Pete, we're going to miss it.
Well, elements of it for sure. I miss smiles, but I don't miss being in my car. It really is fascinating just to talk about how society has changed and maybe in some ways for the better. But in terms of school and schooling and education, I feel like so many questions I want to ask you and so much great reporting that you've got. But I do feel like the biggest problem in America, if I were to identify one, with schools as compared to, say, Germany or Finland or maybe Israel, or I'm just naming countries, but is that we have 13,000 districts.
Yeah.
We have 13,000 principals. And it's same thing you could argue about law enforcement as well. But there's just no general direction. And that can be a good thing, obviously, for some reasons. But right now, with this crisis, you've got parents on Zoom chats and communities just breaking out and arguing about, and we don't even know what the science is about all of this. So I feel like if I were to just start in one place with you in this conversation with what the problem is that we have 13,000 different districts, no federal leadership. The state leadership is questionable. The county, what about all of the confusion that we're in right now?
Well, I definitely agree with you, Pete. And I think that, the lack of federal leadership is obviously at the heart of all of this. It's pretty easy the first thing to know if you're thinking about should I send my kid back to school? If the test positivity rate in your area is above 5%, then you should not send your kid to school. Epidemiologists say your society shouldn't be functioning right now. Nothing should be open if it's over 5%. And the problem that we have right now is people are opening up. The Brookings Institution actually studied this, and they said there's almost no correlation between the number of cases in an area and schools plan to open up. The correlation is between the percentage of people in a county who backed Trump and schools plan to open up.
Oh, no way.
Completely true. This is a Brookings Institution. They're not, they're not a totally left-wing operation. They just did the math on it.
Not at all.
And and Republicans have different views than Democrats on wearing masks and on the seriousness of the issue. By the way, that partisanship is not seen amongst teachers. So it's interesting because we just did this poll of teachers.
Yeah, I want to ask you about your teacher poll. This is where, there's really good reporting from you and NPR here. Go ahead.
Well, it's really nice to work at an organization that has the ability to work with places like Ipsos and do a national poll of teachers to really put some data behind the anecdotes.
Absolutely, it's super important.
But we were interested in breaking out the partisanship, and we found that, teachers overwhelmingly are concerned about coming back to the classroom. No surprise, really very similar between teachers and recent polls of parents and the general public. 2/3 do not want to come back in person. They want to do remote. And we also found even amongst Republican teachers, there was a majority that wanted to teach remotely. So they're not really being swayed. They're looking at what they know from on the ground experience and not being swayed by the rhetoric.
Well, the big problem seems to be with educators is that if they are going to go back, they need to have a certain sense of their own safety. And the analogy I've been using is sending teachers back to school without the proper equipment in terms of masks and protocols and directives and sanitization. I think we have to start, by the way, at the school bus, literally the bus stop. We have to start there. But if you don't send them back to school with the right equipment, et cetera, my analogy is it's like telling a fireman to go in a building without a hose and an oxygen tank and a mask. They wouldn't do it. The fireman wouldn't go into the building. He'd be like, you at least have to give me something to extinguish this fire. The teacher is saying, you at least have to give me the equipment and a set of rules and protocols. And even, by the way, then, who's to say that the kids are going to follow them? The adults can't follow them.
So these are two really important issues that you bring up. So, first of all, the lack of PPE and cleaning equipment, also the lack of trust that teachers have that their schools are going to provide what they say they're going to provide. And that comes from experience, right? So we have decades of disinvestment, underinvestment in public schools. Right now, our public school districts have gotten about $13 billion to help with coronavirus relief. That's less than one airline got. Just one of the airlines, like Delta.
No.
Yeah.
No, it can't be. Get off of the show. Hang up your Zoom.
That was $13 billion. The airlines in general got, I don't know, it was 25 or 50 billion something. Right now there's $100 billion on the table from the White House, but Trump got up and said that he's only going to give that money to schools that open up in person.
This short-sightedness and the lack of understanding of how economics work and the simple communication that you hear so often, but on the right, are these binary things: open the bars, the gyms, and the restaurants. The airlines, none of that matters. if the schools aren't open. If the schools aren't open, and you talk about this in your article and your reporting, a lot of those teachers that you're polling are also parents. They can't go to school and teach my kids if no one's going to watch their kids. Yeah. You have to start with the schools. And I just think, I don't know what it is, I can't explain it, but they don't look at schools as profit centers somehow, which is why, by the way, probably why they've been trying to turn them into profit centers for so long.
I mean, the reason that this is such I kind of think of schools as like a hockey puck, just getting like slapped around by different people, because everyone has a different view of what a school actually is. And honestly, the education secretary, Betsy DeVos, like her entire ethos has been
a school is a church.
Anything but public schools. She is a big fan of charter schools, private school vouchers, homeschooling, and basically anything that's an alternative to public schools. And so this is, the idea of kind of weakening or undermining public schools as an institution. And like, we never could have guessed that we would come to this, but there's a lot that in the conservative ethos that actually serves to undermine the idea of a strong public school and a well-funded public school. And that kind of brought us to where we are right now. But
even if you somehow held the view that our public schools are terrible and I would never send my kid to it and so on, and you touched on this earlier when you talked about prisons, hospitals, and schools, they are still a holding place to keep your kid safe, warm, and fed. The worst school, at least your kid's there. And we can argue all kinds of things about that, of course. But if your kid is of a certain age, K through 6th, 5th, at what point can you leave your kid home alone is the question. And your kid has to go to school so that you can go to work. Period. That's a huge dilemma for parents and teachers right now.
This is a huge thing that is depressing me because ever since I started covering education, I have had this spiel about, like, we forgot to build a social safety net here in the United States. We don't have the social safety net.
We didn't forget.
We were doing other things. All right.
So, well, some of us were trying to do it, and I think a lot of people tried to build a robust safety net, and others were trying to destroy it and take it apart. And so I'll push back on that a little bit. I'll
leave that to you for because I'm a nonpartisan NPR reporter. But
I said some of us.
Yes, we don't have public health care. We don't really have public child care. But we used to have these schools where every kid could go. They fed 30 million children. We have way too many kids living in poverty. And I'm not saying that they provide mental health care, housing assistance, job assistance. Some schools have washing machines so that kids can wash their clothes. The eye doctor comes to school. And, nobody thought this was a good idea to make schools the linchpin of all of those things. But now that they're gone, we have to ask this question of like, how are we going to supply these things? Because the need has only multiplied.
Have you heard or reported on the child abuse issue? Because I've heard this from a lot of people. I guess I didn't realize how important the school, the teachers, the adults in the building were to reporting a child being abused. But of course they are. I mean, so much of the abuse of children being reported comes from an adult in a school. And if kids aren't going to school, and by the way, parents are more desperate and more angry probably than ever before, understandably, you're seeing, not that that's okay, but you're seeing more abuse. How accurate is that? How concerning is that issue?
I mean, of course, it's hugely concerning. And like you said, I mean, it's really a problem of a data void, because what child welfare advocates are saying is that we have less reports, and that is the problem. And you actually have to go to hospitals and see the kind of injuries that they're treating to get a sense of what actually is happening when it comes to children. And, the severe danger that kids are in, it's not just from, domestic violence, which is very serious, and abuse, but also mental health. There's really serious concerns. And I talked to a doctor at the American Academy of Pediatrics who said that he expects to see an uptick in suicidality, really severe mental health issues, just from the social isolation that hits kids and the lack of access to, again, caring adults outside the family.
There are solutions that parents are coming up with and that community organizations are coming up with. Can we talk a little bit about some of them? One of the terrible ones, I think, is what are being called pandemic pods. Terrible because only very few people can afford to do this, and you're also taking resources from the rest of the public. What are they?
Yeah, so everybody has the same kind of set of problems to solve, right? I have to survive, make money, work either inside or outside the home, make sure my kid is safe, make sure that they're educated. And depending on the level of resources that you have, I think what's getting people's dander up about the whole pandemic pod idea is basically, it's called opportunity hoarding, that in some cases, teachers are being hired right out of the public school system, who may be afraid to come back to the classroom, but they're okay to teach like a small group of kids. And it's just the inherent inequity in the middle of this conversation that we're having about, racial equity and George Floyd, that, all of a sudden parents of means are doing what parents of means often do, which is, I'm going to make my own lifeboat and, forget about what happens to everybody else. I'm torn about it because I think that everybody's trying to do the best they can. And what the real problem is it's just the panic thinking that's happening and the kind of seizing of any option, if we take a breath and you think about, okay, what could we do that could possibly benefit and even strengthen the whole community? Maybe we can do a little bit better. And I am starting to see that after a few weeks and the churn happened really quickly, like the pandemic pod thing, like whoosh went up. And there's I swear to God, there's 6 different Silicon Valley startups already that are getting funded. You know it. Come on.
Well, it's so regional and in terms of, affluence and where it lives.
Well, and I think it was some Silicon Valley investor. I think Jason Calcanis had a tweet where he was like, I want to hire the best teacher in the Bay Area, salary, and I'll get you a $2,000 Uber Eats gift card if you refer me to the right person.
Did he get dragged?
Oh my God. Come on.
Good. Okay. I just wanted to make sure I didn't see that. I'm like, fuck off. So I heard you in an interview, I think, describe the crisis that it was going to be like a decades long impact or something like that. Like, how do you articulate and frame the moment that we're in terms of what it means for education schools, this generation of school age kids and how it affects them? Because I don't know how you can make such a statement of such a long-term impact. But since you made it, I know there's data and reason to it, but I don't want to believe it. I don't want to can't we just snap back? I'm a believer in snapping back. Trump is gone. Whoever comes in there, everything returns to normal. It's a preposterous notion. It's not realistic.
I love the optimism.
Yeah, but I cling to snapping back. Can't we just get back to school? The pandemic's over and we just get back to school and everybody learns the way that they need to.
I have to say that since Trump has been elected, I have been paying a lot more attention to international parallels, right? So right after Trump was elected, Masha Gessen, they have a book out now, right? Surviving Autocracy. And they're like, I've been here. I know what it looks like. Yeah. You got to pay attention. This is step 1, step 2, step 3. Similar with the kids out of school. So I wrote a piece very early on, and I had been lucky enough to do some work with Rebecca Winthrop, who you might have run across at Aspen or something else, but she kind of pioneered the whole idea of education in emergencies, which basically was it's in the world of international development and emergency response. So basically refugee camps and that kind of thing.
Okay.
And this idea started to surface a couple of decades ago where they were like, you can't just house and feed people and give them medical care. You also have to think about the children, because there's always tons of children in refugee camps. And just because it's an emergency doesn't mean that you can forget about learning. And so this field developed of emergency education, and it's incredibly relevant right now. And so when I did this piece in March, I was like, okay, well, where are we? And I also personally have done some reporting in the year after Katrina, because I'm from New Orleans. So I spent some time down there in the fall of 2005. And I actually volunteered at a one-room schoolhouse that was opened up after the school shut down. One of my friends from high school's mom was a teacher, and she opened up this literally a classroom of mixed age kids in a unused classroom at Loyola University. And there were no public schools at the time. So this was just it was a hurricane pod, basically. So education in emergencies, the research has followed kids, right? Katrina is really fascinating because the schools closed. Kids went into shelters. They dispersed out to Houston and Baton Rouge, and they were back in school within a few weeks. And a lot of the schools they enrolled in were better than the ones that they had left. And by the next spring, most of them were back at home in New Orleans. The schools were closed from August through November, December. Despite the fact that their interruption was so short, it took them 2 years to get back to where they had been.
Okay. Is that research? You feel like there's enough of that? That's not, you can't do a randomized controlled study on that because you wouldn't want to force students into a tragedy. But do you feel like that kind of is enough to be able to look at on a larger scale what a worldwide emergency would do to truncate learning?
I'll give you 2 more data points.
Okay.
One was in Rwanda. Rwanda was obviously a much bigger disruption, right? Genocide. That took about 12 to 16 years. So by the time that people who were children and completed their education, they had basically caught up, but it really took that whole time. And then there's examples from Puerto Rico. A lot of schools have closed after Puerto Rico. There's examples actually from the polio epidemics in New York City, where you could see a difference between the kids because schools, they didn't actually close down, but what they did was they said, you don't have to come to school. And a lot of people didn't.
When was that though?
That was a mid 40s, right before the vaccine, a mid 1940s polio epidemic in New York City.
So given all of that research, I mean, that's pretty great data points to back up this idea of how long-term the damage will be. Mm-hmm. If we're in by perfect world, I mean a well-resourced community, what data do we have about the difference between distance learning or asynchronous learning, is it called, and traditional in school, in classroom learning? Can kids learn as well in a different format? What do we know?
So
if it's properly resourced, because you obviously get into the issues of just simple resources, technology, internet connections, computers, etc.
So I want to reframe a little bit to say that traditional education is a leveler, right? And no matter how huge the disruption is, even in Rwanda, there were families that were rich enough to send their kids to boarding school in France, right? Elite. They got everyone. There's always a way to get out. So there's going to be families who find room in the lifeboat or they make a lifeboat.
Right.
And so there's this polarization of outcomes, right? With online learning. And so online learning itself is divided into synchronous and asynchronous, where synchronous means it's real time, right? Sync is time.
Got it. That's what I meant.
Asynchronous is it could be anything from they put up a PowerPoint and then you do your homework later. Online versus in-person learning. Again, it's very polarized. So there is a tiny bit of evidence that a truly personalized online learning program married to a really self-directed kid or a motivated person with some backup, some family backup. That family backup doesn't have to be knowledgeable. They can just be supportive. Okay. In that scenario, you do have kids that Zoom. They really go ahead. When you go to self-paced, there are kids that double the speed. Because a classroom is a leveler.
Right. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I'm trying to think about my daughters.
Are they going to be that kid?
I don't know that they're Zooming anywhere. What does it mean when your child refuses to be upright while learning? I will walk in and she is in her bed under her comforter with her laptop lying down. And my compromise is could you sit up? Is that too much to just sit up and learn?
I mean, there's two issues here. There's standardization and there's motivation, right? So we created a system that is very coercive. Even when it's high level and challenging, there's a lot of coercion around grades and achievement and competition. And those are the things that we kind of train kids to go after, even the so-called good students. We train them to go after the grades because, good students will maximize whatever metric you give them, right? They're just going after that. But what we often lose is the internal drive.
we lose that when we change the format of our education, or we lose that along the way?
We lose it in our traditional education system because we don't ask our kids what they want to do.
Right.
We don't ask them what's important to them, and we don't give them the opportunity to find it, to really stare at that blank page. I mean, you know what a creative person does. They give themselves a prompt. Sure. They give themselves some accountability. They might have peers to cheer them on. They might have a mentor. But ultimately, it's up to them. Like, it's up to you as a creative person to say, I want to create this show, and it's going to be it's the thing that only I can do. No class assignment is going to lead to that necessarily. There's not going to be an AP course in becoming like the kind of broadcaster that you are.
It's so well said. And I mean, I still don't know. My daughter said, I will miss going to school for all the obvious reasons, but I'm doing better. I'll get better grades with this format. And I was like kind of torn. I was like, because of what you just said, because of the pressure for grades and college and all the bullshit, I was like, well, what do I want for you? It's a weird thing, but she is justified in her brain. She's like, I can do better. I can get better grades. She gets pretty good grades, but she felt like she was getting better grades doing it this way from home. So
I think that's entirely possible, and a lot of kids, especially teenagers, are very distracted by the social hierarchies at school and the pressures and just the general stuff around being an adolescent. And then, I mean, they need all of that too. That's all part of their development, but to be able to escape from it, I think is there's something to be said for that as well.
What do you know? What have you heard about what teachers want? Because it's very easy to demonize teachers, which is a really interesting and bizarre development over the last 10 years. My mom was a public school teacher, and I've been working with public school teachers unions for years now. And it's crazy to hear what kind of things get said and thought about teachers. But now, it's easy to look at teachers and say, well, you don't, you certainly need certain subjects, maybe even it's got to be easier for you not having to go to school and deal with the kids. But from what I've heard anecdotally from a lot of teachers is it's much more work. And that's true, of course, of a lot of different jobs. It can be a lot more work, and without limits and without, class ending, it's like all day. What is the point? I'm sure there's some disagreement in it, but what do teachers generally say about what they prefer? Because final point, very easy to look at them as as you're hearing some people say, go back to school, do your job, you're a teacher. And the teacher's like, you go back with this snotty-nosed kid, literally.
I mean, so teaching is probably more dangerous than a lot of different professions because of the lack of ability to get kids to wear PPE. I think that's a really serious issue, especially in high school. I mean, from what I know of the science so far, and it's emerging, the older the kid is, the more dangerous it is, basically. Little kids are not spreading it quite as much, but then again, they're not wearing their masks either. So it is dangerous. And teachers are legitimately concerned about what the enforcement of this social distancing and the masking actually does to their teaching. Because first of all, like I quoted a teacher in my story today who said, I'm a white teacher in a black school in Philadelphia. And if my job is to make sure they never get closer than 6 feet apart and that they keep their masks on all day, that's not the kind of teacher I want to be, because I've basically been turned into a low grade cop.
I was thinking about that, reading that and going, yeah, all day. This is what you're going to hear a teacher. Space, distance, Michael, space, distance. And it's like, how do you, it's hard enough. I always like to talk about the 15 minutes I spent in school teaching kids. And on minute 16, I wanted to rip a kid's head off. And that was like teachers go in all day, every day, and do this pretty much year round. It's so hard, just the behavioral issues, much less the content. How about the special ed teachers? How about the kids who, don't really understand the importance of wearing a mask and need a certain physical touch and affection for any number of developmental disability reasons? That's makes that job so much harder and more dangerous.
I'll tell you what I would do, to be honest with you. If in the situation that we're in right now, I would bring the teachers with the kids in any outdoor space that you have to have games, to meet up for socially distanced games, break the ice, Do it for a few weeks if you want. Do it once a week. Go home and do your learning, but get to know each other in person totally for fun and not try to put any pressure on it. And then go home and do the learning, because once you have the relationship established, the online learning will go much more smoothly.
That's a really good piece of advice. Yeah.
Well, and New York City public schools are doing the opposite. They're removing recess because they don't think they have space to do it socially distanced. And their literal plan is for the kids to sit in the classroom all day long through lunch and go home with no recess.
I mean, it does seem like every time you come up with a good idea, there is somebody or some decent reason to be like, this is why that won't work. It's like, why don't we just teach the kids outside? Okay, until November, or when it rains, like, it's a good idea until it's not a good idea. It's a good idea until you realize the resources it requires don't exist. And I think that's what's so frustrating with education policy experts and teachers, just trying to come up with solutions for this and then try them out and get them to work.
I mean, it's hard for us here in this city because we saw them, they saw the Javits Center converted into a hospital. We saw the tent set up in Central Park. We saw the Navy ship come. All those things ended up being useless and they didn't take any patients. But the point was the effort was made. The strings were pulled. They figured out a way. Why can't they do it for the kids?
What do you think that is about? I mean, is there any way to explain why there's a sense of urgency for public health is not extending to public education, which is also obviously public health? I
think it goes back to the number of different people who were whacking away at the puck, if you're going to permit me a sports analogy, right? Because for example, you have the teacher unions, right? And I don't vilify them. I don't have any, but they are very protective of their people. And that's what their job is. And so anything that involved the teacher, for example, teaching outside, that's going to pass through a pretty severe filter, Then you have, and this is just, that's not just New York City problem. That's why you have a situation right now where across the country, childcare centers are open while schools are closed. Because the childcare centers being in the private sector, and sometimes they're nonprofits and they have private-public partnerships, they were able to be nimble.
Right. And by the way, that's the argument for the kind of the quote reformers is privatizing allows there to be more acuity or movement, but it's also not true because they're still going to be regulated by the state. So I'm not sure if that's even accurate.
Absolutely. And I think, no one's suggesting that you go back to the days of childminders and settlement house nurseries. We're basically going back to the turn of the century right now, It's not an ideal situation at all, but the point is, how can you create that kind of flexibility while also having this commitment to the mission and the funding, frankly, that only public schools can and should have?
Let's talk about your book as it relates to all of this, because it really does tie in so many different ways with education, because parenting, teachers are parents. Parents are teachers, and we're all trying to figure out how to parent during the pandemic. And you wrote one of the most important books for parents in our generation of parents. I mean, literally, it's that important. The Art of Screen Time, How Your Family Can Balance Digital Media in Real Life, came out last year, now out in paperback, and everybody should go get this book. But you say in your most recent New York Times article, you would make maybe some subtle changes, or maybe you did make changes in a paperback as it relates to the pandemic, because screen time and technology has been central during the pandemic for parents, for education, and almost for babysitting. What do you change or moderate, if anything?
So I wrote this piece for the paperback release, and I wrote a new preface because I feel like I always tried to be very open about the fact that balance looks different for different families and that we need to not guilt ourselves. But I think we just went through we're in the middle of such an enormous transition right now, and nobody's okay. Parents are definitely not okay. A lot of our kids are not okay. People without kids are not okay. This is not an okay time, right? So we need to really work really hard to let go of perfectionism and the guilt and the shame that stops us from making better choices. And for me, so I wrote this piece because it starts with kind of admitting that, we're not going to have perfection anytime soon. And so the key is harm reduction and repair. our kids don't benefit from us never making a mistake, but they benefit from us modeling how we get forgiveness and how we do better. And I translate that into screen time because a lot of us are doing things that we may not be as proud of, or they give us misgivings on a day-to-day basis just to get through the day. And that includes sort of like letting your kid binge on various kinds of screens because you have to get work done. And the key thing that I'm trying to help parents do is, first of all, you can make less bad choices. You can encourage slower forms of media. Audio is one that I, agree with, lean into. Of course, that's my medium, but things are
audio for kids, like audio books and audio lessons. I haven't really thought about that.
Audiobooks, podcasts for the
I never think about that. I mean, it's what I do for a living too, obviously. And I never ever think, it's always read a book or watch whatever you want for as long as you want. But it's play whatever you want, games, interactive. There's kind of those three choices. But yeah, I never really thought about more audio for the.
We got to get the kids hooked on podcast feed.
For sure.
This is my long game.
Yeah, no doubt. I'm all for it. But I just wasn't, I guess I hadn't really thought of that. That's a great idea. Go ahead. Sorry.
No. I'm glad to hear that. I mean, and the other one is for the little kids. There's actually a whole genre of like quite dull and slow paced, but very good for them, read aloud videos on YouTube. So it's actually just a person reading a book. So it's a quirky alternative, right? But
that's really good. Well. No, that's really good. It's really good, especially if it's the right type of video for the kid. What about when you say focus on feelings, not on screens? I thought that was a really interesting part of your Times piece about the book.
Well, so what I've done a deep dive into and had a lot of time to personally think about in the last few months is the way that the problems that are with technology are not really with technology, but it's what are you using the technology for, and what we're often doing is we are retreating into our phones out of like an uncomfortable situation, boredom, even anger or some other rough moment. And we're all on top of each other all the time. So the phone really becomes like your private space in a shared space. And the kids do this too. They do it to process stress. They do it to create their own little world that they have control over. And so what we're trying to do then is to understand the role that it plays in their lives and in our lives so that we can have other coping mechanisms beyond the screen itself and maybe use it a little more thoughtfully as well.
Do you think, forget if you write about this in your book, but just my final question here is to, I'm really put a huge focus on always have nature as the answer to almost everything.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Have you noticed? I mean, I live in the burbs, but there is a lot of data. I don't think we even need much of it, but like bike shops can't keep bikes in stock. Kids are going outside in a way they haven't before now, in a way that we did growing up before we had all these screens. What can you say about how important outside is and has been during this pandemic?
I mean, I've never relied on it more. I've never spent more time in my local parks. And I see people fleeing the city to get a little bit of breathing room. It just is the antidote to everything. It reminds us that, the world is bigger than us and our problems. And yeah, I hope to instill a real fierce love of nature in my kids, especially over the next couple of years of craziness. I think it's a great antidote. And
I talk to animals a lot. Not necessarily out loud, I think more telepathically. I don't want anybody to overhear me. But I said to this blue jay the other day, I was like, hey man, what do you, or woman, I can't tell the difference. I go, what do you think of all this crazy shit around the pandemic? And the blue jay was like, don't care. And then flew away. Nothing's changed. It's like, I see a lot more people out here. Mm-hmm. It really, the point of that is it's very regulating in a way when you get out and see how much bigger the world is than in your own four walls. And I think, like you said, an antidote. So get outside with your kids as much as you can. All right. Well, we got to do this again as soon as you want. I love talking to you, and everybody should be following you on Twitter. And really, like, you're a great reporter who digs deep and develops great sources on this stuff. And I just want to tout that when we talk about journalism and news and and everything. Like, you have been at this for a long time. You have so many sources and such a great way of explaining and reporting. If everybody looks at your reporting at NPR and your colleagues that you work with and the kind of education parenting beat, it's really a very important source as we're trying to figure this out. And I think it's worth mentioning you and your colleagues are trying to figure it out as well. And you're doing as good a job as anybody. So thank you very much for your great reporting. And thank you very much for joining me. And everybody should get your book right now, The Art of Screen Time. If you are a parent, you should have this book. If you aren't a parent, but you know a parent, you should buy this book for that parent. There you go.
Thank you,
Anya. Really appreciate it.
Great talking with you.
She's on Twitter at Anya1. Anya, get that book, read her at NPR, and tell her you heard her here on Stand Up. Really, I can't speak. Really good is what I was trying to say. I just need to strike the word really from my vocabulary if we really want to be honest. All right, next up is a long conversation with David Gessner, who is a prolific writer and author and professor of creative writing. Really, just a fascinating guy. He's written 11 books about, they blend nature and humor. He's a funny guy, environmentalism, including this new book, Leave It As Is, A Journey Through Theodore Roosevelt's American Wilderness, and the New York Times bestselling, All the Wild That Remains. And I love talking to him. It was the first time we ever talked, and I think it went pretty well. I learned a lot from him, and I hope that you enjoyed this conversation with David Gessner, and I hope that you give his book, which is out. Is it out yet? You can check it out wherever you get books. Please check it out, and please tell him that you heard him on the show. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Here it is. It's interesting that you say you have a writing shed, because I'm building a podcasting like studio digital shed right now, and I know that Michael Pollan wrote a book about his writing shed a few years ago. And I wonder, as someone who is one of my favorite people to read now, that I've really been getting into your stuff, and nature is my religion and very important to me. And going from working in the corporate world at SiriusXM on the 37th floor of a Manhattan skyrise to being in my backyard garden and woods in that space, what will happen? What happens? How does it change your work?
I had a professor named Lucia Berlin who said when you go to your writing studio, your place, you go to a different place. And she meant mentally as well as physically. I mean, for me, I go right back to the granddaddy of them all. I always say, well, a few years ago, I was at Walden Pond with my daughter up on my shoulders, and I pointed to where the foundation of Thoreau's house was, and I said, that's where the man lived who ruined Daddy's life. Because, I read Walden when I was 16, and goodbye law school. You talk about the corporate world, goodbye everything. And I always remembered that line of Thoreau's, the life that men praise and call successful is but one kind. So, he was both showing you nature, but also saying there's another way to live. So for me, I right away started keeping journals after, reading Walden in high school. But it took me about 30 more years till I built my own cabin. We bought this house on Hewlett's Creek, which is actually Dawson's Creek from the TV show, which is pretty funny.
Is that why you bought it? Because you were such a fan of that show? No.
In fact, my joke was I was living on Cape Cod writing about ospreys. The audience can't see it, but you can see over my shoulders a couple Audubon pictures of ospreys. And the book ended that I wrote, I Will Stay on Cape Cod Forever, which is how I got my job in North Carolina, because there's some professors read it. So I was in love with Cape Cod, and I moved down here and weirdly ended up buying a house on the creek that's the fictional Cape Cod, because Dawson Creek is supposed to take place there.
Wow. Oh, so it's like a place in North Carolina that kind of has things that look a little like the Cape.
Yeah. So
you tried to recreate the Cape in North Carolina. How is it? There's got to be major differences. What do you like? What do you miss?
Hurricanes are a lot stronger.
Yeah. How'd you do the other night?
Yeah. Well, I got about 3 feet inside the writing shack. And I, in past hurricanes, I've had to kayak down to it.
Oh, wow.
So on my 50th birthday, First of all, I had a kegger on my 50th birthday, which
Really?
is pretty impressive.
That's funny.
and then most of the people drank sophisticated drinks, but my friend and I did what we could.
What was in the keg?
It was Two Hearted Ale, which I don't drink anymore, but I used to.
Sounds sophisticated.
And the next morning, I started hammering away and built this writing shack.
You built it yourself?
I did.
Impressive.
One thing when you're a writer, you don't make money for a million years. And so I had worked as a framing carpenter.
Oh, that's impressive. That's very impressive.
As I say, I was a very bad carpenter, but I was persistent.
I still admire a very bad carpenter. I've tried to learn the basics since I bought a home, and I've tried to help my friend and listener, Nick, who's really leading this project, turning my shed into the Shedio that I'll name after him. But nice. I just feel like I don't have the aptitude. I get things done, but it's always crooked and feels wrong. But something about building the space that I'll be working in, what does that do for you, and how does it affect your creativity?
Well, strangely, I have found, and I keep saying I'm a bad carpenter because I'm worried that my friends I worked carpentry with 30 years ago are going to hear this and say, oh my God, he's bragging about his carpentry when he was terrible.
I'll stop.
But I have gotten better. And one of the things I like about it is it's very like writing in the sense you're problem solving and you're absorbed in the problems. You're not thinking about your own troubles.
Yeah.
You're externally focused. So I didn't use any power tools. I just cedar shingled it, speaking of Cape Cod, so it looks like the Cape. I rebuilt it because it got wiped out during Hurricane Florence. I rebuilt it and put 18 boogie boards below it. So it's like it's got flotation below it.
Oh.
So it was supposed to rise the other night. That did not happen. So that was a failed experiment.
You should document that failure, though. You should document that.
So I do my real writing in the room I'm in right now in the morning, and then go into school and do my work, take a nap, and then I head down there around 5, beer in hand, and that's kind of my secondary writing, the shack writing, where I don't have any ambition and schedule the way I do in the morning, and I've gotten a lot of good stuff out of it because it's kind of the anti-professional part of my day. I read and whatever else and brainstorm.
I love it. I love hearing about that and the differences in the times that you write. I can't write. I'm so impressed with your writing and who taught you to. You're obviously a professor. You're the chair of the department of creative writing. But
yeah,
who taught you? University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Who taught you to write? How did you learn to write?
Well, I was a huge reader, and I was hugely ambitious it was kind of a flaw early on. My last book was a memoir of playing ultimate Frisbee, and as my guys I played with would tell you, my ego was way too big when I was younger. I had to get that beaten out of me. And so my first books, I graduated from college and I said, I am going to become a novelist, because of course that was the crown then, who heard of creative nonfiction and all that. So, and the first novels were so clunky. I mentioned Thoreau, like characters are quoting Thoreau to each other in these novels. And it's just, but one thing I did do was I stuck with it and I, wrote every day and made that a habit. So 3 bad books later, the writing started getting better and more distilled. And I didn't figure out until I started turning my fictional, what I'd learned as a fiction writer toward nonfiction. Like by that, I mean scene and dialogue. And that a huge influence on me was my college professor, Walter Jackson Bate, who was a biographer of Samuel Johnson and John Keats. And the thing I loved about Bate is he talked about biography, and this kind of relates to the Roosevelt book. He talked about biography as a selfish reading act because you're stealing what you can put to use, what habits you can steal from them, and I think it's so fascinating right now in like kind of the cancel age that it's the totally opposite way to go to the greats. Of course you see their flaws and their troubles, but you're also just looking for secrets, basically. Like you said that about the writing shack, you're looking. So gradually I kind of started to try to do an autobiography, what Bate had done in biography.
Well, your new book is real good, fascinating, important, and certainly timely for a number of reasons. But to pull back the curtain, I had booked you over a week ago, and it was yesterday that the President of the United States signed the Great American Outdoors Act, which is supposed to preserve and protect our national parks. Now, before we get to probably one of the most embarrassing moments in American history, can we just talk a little bit about what he was doing in that piece of legislation? Because you obviously have written a book about Theodore Roosevelt and how he thought this was a very important thing for America to conserve land, and that's just what he did, and we can get into it. But what does this act do for that legacy of conservation in our country?
First, I'll try to be positive for a little bit, because it's kind of hard when we talk about the pronouncer of Yoseminites yesterday. But I'll say that historically in this country, even before Roosevelt, in fact, at the founding of this country, there was a decision to value public land, a decision that factored into the writing of the Constitution, in fact, and continued as we moved westward. And it never was a liberal or conservative issue. So one of the things I've enjoyed about the types of books I've been writing recently, for instance, the Tarball Chronicles, when I went down to the Gulf during the oil spill, my hero in that book was a big conservative hunting guide who called Obama my president and teased me about being liberal while I teased him about being conservative. But we had the Gulf and the dirtying of the Gulf and the soiling of the Gulf and that fight in common. So all that to say, it is one of the few issues where there's overlap, real clear overlap. And I find that particularly when I'm out on the road, when I'm at home watching, MSNBC, CNN, or flicking over to Fox, you don't see it at all. But when you're out in the world, I feel like the land, knowing the land, is not a liberal or conservative issue. So that's the positive. And certainly anything that, as this does, that saves land and brings it to light is good. But I did write to another writer yesterday who follows this more closely as kind of a beat writer. And I just said, what's the catch? Because if you have one of the most anti-environmental presidents in history and anti-environmental congressmen in history.
It's Trump Tower, the geyser. It's
exactly.
He's building a Trump Tower right on top of Old Faithful, I think.
Well, that's pretty much what it is. It's fossil fuel. The funding comes from continued development of the land for coal and gas. And meanwhile, as you know from having just looked at the book, this is a guy who is trying to reverse the Antiquities Act, which is the opposite, because the Antiquities Act, well, the way it should be, is you're putting land aside that is not for oil and gas. So they've made inroads into that as well.
Right, Bears Ears specifically.
Bears Ears, but also right now in a district court in District of Columbia, the fate of the Antiquities Act is being decided. And so, this is, I can't say I'm against the Great Outdoors Act. I'm glad and I'm excited that people are agreeing about something for once, but you can't help but be slightly skeptical given the participants in this.
Well, let me just ask you a broad general question about, how you framed the overlap between liberals and conservatives on conservation, and that there's a common interest there. Because if I were to reframe it, I would say the kind of the push and pull has always been between humans' interest in growing and developing and using the land, not only for recreation, we can talk about the importance of that, but more importantly or more dangerously, to develop and make money out of. So if there is oil or gas or any important element under that ground, then they want to pull the money out. They want to build homes for more people. We see the wildfires in California as a result of just human development and growth. So it would seem that the push and pull for at least a generation, if not, I don't know, 3, you tell me, has been about developing that land to make money on it, or conserving it for all of the other obvious reasons, including human recreation on it? How do you frame that and where we're at? Because it's always a push and pull. We do have to live. You talk about the hypocrisy of just human existence, which I appreciate.
Well, I mean, I would say, obviously it goes back many, many generations. Bernard DeVoto, who wrote in the 1940s and 50s, wrote brilliantly about he wrote an essay called The West Against Itself. The way the West, there's a great line he has, the attitude of the Westerner toward the Easterner was, get out and give us money. Because you had, this kind of rustic, wild, free socialism going on with the public land being leased for cheap to ranchers. So this has always been this conflict. I've found that the title of my book, which actually my wife tells me pops up when I send an email because it's below, I find like saying, leave it as it is, a lot is very helpful. I said, that's what you could have done to solve the pandemic. You see those bats in that cave? Leave them as they are, and it's like, and I love that that's Roosevelt's kind of, response. Now, obviously,
that's his response when that's an actual quote from when he first gazed upon the Grand Canyon. Is that
exactly? Yeah. And it's just so antithetical to human nature that I have burbles of hope and optimism, but I just know human beings, they never can leave it as it is, right? I mean, we're always on to the next thing. A great quote from a professor of mine when I went to grad school in University of Colorado, a man named Reg Sonner, he said, we humans are an elsewhere. Think of that. Like, even when you're trying to do your breathing exercises and be in the present, your mind's always jumping off. And as a people, that's kind of defined us as that. So the ability to leave some places as they are, which is battling against basic human nature, right? Not to exploit, is one of the great things we've done. Now, it's much more complicated than that, because as I say in the book, we're talking about land that was originally native land.
Right.
Hey, this is totally off subject. I'm sad we left writing behind there at the beginning. We were starting to talk about the writing. Let's later on double back to that, because I love talking about the process of creating stuff.
I would be happy to. I would absolutely be happy to. I worry that wasn't interesting to you or other people, but I think once I heard that Michael Pollan wrote a book about his writing shed, and once I heard you just mention it right there, I was like, you know what, the space that you work in, I don't care if you're an accountant or an artist, does matter, and there's a lot to be said about that space and changing that space and so on. But let me just dispense with kind of the newsy thing, and I really want to get obviously into the guts of your amazing new book, which everybody should buy right now. Leave It As It Is. David Gessner, my guest, and he's written a whole bunch of other books which are very important as well. So I wonder if you can hear this. Yesterday, when the president was signing the Great Outdoors Act, of course, you and most of the conscious world now knows that he butchered the pronunciation of arguably the nation's most popular, recognized, and loved national parks. And I wonder if you, being who you are in your career, and there's a whole chapter about Yosemite in your new book, if when you hear this, and I'll play it for you because I want to watch you, if there's a cellular breakdown of any sort, listen to it, and I'll watch you on the Zoom.
Yosemites, towering sequoias.
Well, is there any consolation that he nailed the pronunciation of sequoia?
Did he, though? I thought he had sequoia a little off, too. I thought it was more a K than the Q. I know he did it two different ways. He Yosemite, and then even more interesting, Yoseminites, like it was some biblical term.
I do want to ask you just two quick questions. One, Yosemite there's an Indian tribe there called the Awani, and they I think named it that, right? And it was supposed to be the mountain is somehow resembling like an open mouth or something like that, yawning or something. So what is the history there? And more importantly, to some extent, why does it matter that the President of the United States can pronounce Yosemite accurately?
Well, it's interesting because Yosemite was already in the news in the last 2 weeks, because Yosemite, of course, is the central place, the beloved place of John Muir, who the Sierra Club just said, not so fast. We've been he's our founder. You've been our person for 100 years, and now we're going to start to question you. And so Yosemite's already had that focus. And Yosemite also, for the purposes of the book, the section in there is, I have these interludes that are kind of written in a fictional sort of third person way.
Yeah.
And I write about the very famous, I'd say Yosemite is the home of, maybe Jesus' 40 Days in the Desert is the most famous camping trip, but the second might be John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt, while he is president, skirting the party he's supposed to go to and skirting civilization and heading with John Muir up into the wilderness, into a snowstorm, during which the Secret Service report said the president for a while was mired down in the snow. So, and then they camp out and around a fire and wake up with 4 inches of snow on them. So that's pretty extraordinary for a sitting president. And I bring it up because in that section in the book, I come in as a character from the future. And one of the things I can see related to the earlier Yosemite controversy is how these two figures will be regarded as the decades pass, and how, they would not have known. I mean, certainly Roosevelt was aware of something like the cancel culture. He fought back against it all the time. He said the man in the arena is the one we should revere, not the scold and the critic. So that I come in as a figure in that chapter and kind of let them know where things have moved reputationally. And it's interesting because Muir says after that trip, can I help it if I was a little in love with Roosevelt? And I end that chapter saying, look, I understand what's wrong with these guys. I understand their flaws. I lay out their flaws. And I might lose my membership in the Biographers Guild for saying so. But can I help it if I'm half in love with Teddy too? A president who goes out through the snow. So there, I bring it up because there you have the antithesis. There you have a president who got it, and the it being a world beyond the human world and a world beyond the anthropocentric, of someone who loved being out in nature. You said nature is your religion. It certainly was his. And then on the other pole, we have Yosemite Sam here, who, who didn't even see that cartoon when he was young. Couldn't he pronounce it?
I thought maybe I gave him the benefit of the doubt, which I rarely do on yesterday's episode. But then I realized at that time, my dad definitely watched and knew who Yosemite Sam was, because that's what I watched. And my dad used to talk about how he liked him for some reason. and my dad is about the same age as Trump. So it wouldn't be too far-fetched.
So it's just, to me, it's just like, I say in the book, at one point in the book, I have them engage in a fist fight, I believe, Trump and Roosevelt. And, Trump's got the advantage in terms of pure mass. But Roosevelt was an
throws his weight around.
Athlete and, jiu-jitsu and boxing. So
I would imagine Trump gets winded fairly quickly, especially compared to Roosevelt. Because, has Trump ever even put on shoes that would be considered for the outdoors? I would imagine all of Donald Trump's shoes are made for unnatural surfaces. I bet he doesn't even rock a flip-flop. Oh, what a horrible image, by the way. I just thought of Trump's foot. I'm so sorry, everybody. We have to
watch it lest we get sucked down the Trump hole.
Yes. So how do you reconcile your admiration for Teddy Roosevelt with his treatment of Native peoples? You're seeing the statue being taken down in front of the American Museum of Natural History, the Black Lives Matter movement. We still don't have a major, I think, important movement for Native and tribal people, although they won a pretty good Supreme Court case, which was not a bad thing, usually bad headlines for them a couple weeks ago. How do you square your admiration with the man and what he accomplished in terms of conservation, and how history is looking back, giving him a second glance?
Well, I don't square it, is what as I say in the book, I in this instance, if we're going to give him credit for being beyond his time, ahead of his time, in conservation and on some other issues too. I say in the book, by the time he came back as a bull moose candidate, he had a platform that would make Bernie blush. I mean, he's the guy who set he set all the things that would in the Square deal that would be, that would become his distant cousin's platform. So he had that going for him. But in terms of treatment of Native Americans, there's no squaring it. I mean, he's got this actually kind of antiquated even then idea of manifest destiny. He's got an American first, overlap with Trump, though he's 1,000 times smarter and reads a book a night. And the Native people are in the way. I'm not saying this at all as a rationalization, but later he does come to know the culture a lot better. Goes down and hikes into a kiva, has many members of the Rough Riders who are Native people, but he never really gets, his attitude doesn't really evolve. So I let it sit there, and it's part of this incredibly messy, hypocritical, complex picture that is Roosevelt. And I just think that it's, you said at the beginning, it's a good time. It's either a really good time or really bad time for this book to come out. Either I'm going to end up getting canceled because I'm, defending Teddy, or he's got something to teach us right now. And I think it's the latter. And I think that we can go to these figures, and everybody's like, don't deify them. I don't deify him. I see his flaws, but I do think there are things I can go to him and see, like the energy, the directness, the commitment, these things that I do admire. Now, I can still dislike other parts of him. So I just think we're in this either or place, that not to circle back around to Mr. Trump, but I do think he's part of, obviously, the creation of this. We can't get at him. He's uncancelable every day. He does something that would have gotten any other president kicked out of the job. And so, we're lashing at out at a lot of these people. And some are very justified. I mean, I live in a town full of Southern monuments, many of which were put up not after the Civil War, but 50 years later by the Daughters of the Confederacy as nostalgic remembrance. And we want those gone. I mean, they should all come down.
That's Wilmington, North Carolina.
And Teddy's statue should come down too. But I mean, you got to remember that at the same time that the museum did that, they named their Hall of Biodiversity after Roosevelt, which is perfect. Take down the worst of him and hold up the best.
I think the Met has the Hall of dinosaurs named after seriously the Koch brothers, their donation, which is hilarious because it's dinosaurs and fossil fuels and where they were at on fossil fuels, but it's also I don't think their name should be up there. So, we have this president at this time, and we're in a transition period. And I think it's important to look at, what the future holds based on history, which is a long way of getting to the point in your book, which you kind of trace Teddy Roosevelt's history yourself. You traveled a lot for this book back in the olden days when travel was free and allowed. And you went to a lot of different places that you write about, and I thought maybe we could talk about a couple, because I think it's, in your writing, you're always great, like every great writer who writes about nature, describing nature and its importance, and you do that, of course, here and in all your work. Where did you go? What did you learn? What did you discover? A place you hadn't been to before?
Well, I'll sneak in a little writing. I said I wanted to talk writing before.
Yeah, go for it.
And it's related to this, though. I quoted my friend Reg Sonner before, but another quote of his is talking about the pleasures of the difficult. So a couple of books ago, when I wrote about Edward Abbey and Wallace Stegner, I did something similar, where I took a trip, I wove in their dual biographies, and I did kind of an state of the environment and environmental history. And that's a lot to kind of, organize. And I wanted to kind of rate it, and reared aside that what's happened in creative nonfiction in this way actually has a parallel in narrative TV, good narrative TV, the way it cuts between things. So, and I wanted to do that, and I wanted to do the Roosevelt book like that, because I was kind of bored with straight narrative. You know what I mean? So like for this,
I don't know what you mean by being bored with it. I can understand why someone like you would be, but I'm not anywhere near, But yes, go ahead. I mean, because it is a really unique way to write and innovative, and for you, probably challenging to do something so different and also great.
Thank you. And so I wanted to have the biography of Roosevelt. I make no claim to being, I feel like more of a biographical adventurer. I do literary criticism of other biographies, right? So I have that line. I have the thinking about the environment now and history of environment. But the part you mentioned is the travel. And it played out really nicely in that my nephew was graduating from college. When I graduated from college, I grew up in Massachusetts. I went west, and it really changed the way I looked at things. And so I was going to bring him west. Now it turned out, whoops, I don't know what just happened. I lost you there
I'm here. I still hear you and see you. So
I'm bringing you back. There you are. So
was that troubling for you to lose my image at that point?
I missed you.
So,
I really did, with your Imagine shirt.
I'm wearing my John Lennon Why Hunger shirt. Yeah. So you wanted to bring him with you.
But it turned out to be advantageous too, in that he was kind of a foil, because he was like rolling his eyes. We'd be listening to Teddy Roosevelt tapes and books, and he'd be like, enough with this guy. And, I asked him early on in the book if he'd read anything he liked lately. And his hero was the dude of Big Lebowski.
That's fun.
And he was kind of like that. My nephew was very quiet and mellow. And so he was like, enough with this Roosevelt guy. But by the end, he was probably one of the most knowledgeable young people in the world on Roosevelt that had been forced on him. So
shit, if you ever do something like that again, I would pay to go on a leg of that trip with someone like you. Like talking to you is real exciting. Reading your book and reading your work and looking at your whole career. But what I find about talking to people like yourself who write about nature or who write about anything is if you get the opportunity to go be in their natural element with them as they're documenting it, it's a privilege of the lifetime. It must be amazing to just be out in nature with you.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, years ago, I wrote a book called The Prophet of Dry Hill about John Hay, the great Cape Cod nature writer. And it was a real privilege for me to kind of be with him. And the thing I remember about him was how outward focused he was. He said to me something like, the way to solve your problems of your mind is not through your mind. It's never going to, that's a knot that's never going to get untied. And so looking outward, looking at birds, looking at the ocean, and he had a great line, which was, because this was still the last century, he said, strange to have come through the whole century and find the most interesting thing is the birds, or rather maybe it's the human mind is more interesting when looking at the birds. And he has a strange connection to the Teddy Roosevelt book, because his grandfather was Roosevelt's Secretary of State, John Hay. So
wow. That's I'll have to read John Hay now, of course. John Hay now.
Hey, can I slip back to the travel for a sec, because I never really answered your. I've noticed.
So wherever you want to go.
Your questions, but we're talking.
No, it's fine. But, we're just talking. Go ahead.
So I pick up my nephew in North Carolina. We head up the coast to D.C., where an old classmate of mine, Jamie Raskin, who you might have seen recently on CNN, is
Congressman.
Yeah, and he
was on the show maybe a month ago.
I dropped in with him back then. Of course, they were the minority party, so he was like not involved in anything. Now it's totally changed, because
How do you know him?
He was a classmate in college.
What kind of guy is he? I really like him a lot.
Well, it's funny because I really like him a lot too, and he was just that way in college and just active. While we were at our reunion, the last time he spoke, and he brought John Lewis up to speak in this little bar, and so I got to see John Lewis about 2 years ago. It was great, and meet him and shake his hand. But he was
I met him once too. It was a magical.
But he was the class president. I was the political cartoonist for the newspaper, and my editor was Bill McKibben
Oh, wow. What another interesting connection. I want to keep doing this with you. It's like the 6 degrees of separation to David Gessner or any of the people we're mentioning. Yeah,
so then we continued up the coast. But then the real excitement of the trip for my nephew and for me was when we broke out of the East Coast and, the land started to crack and rise and we go into the Badlands and we wake up the next morning, with buffalo outside the tent. And
cool.
And it was just so thrilling. And for me, I moved west. I lived in Massachusetts till I was 30, and I had testicular cancer when I was 30 and recovered in Massachusetts and then moved to Colorado. And it was always this just incredibly exhilarating opening up, part of my life. So I wanted him to kind of get the feel of it too. And of course, being in the Badlands allowed me to write about 2 great books. Mornings on Horseback, which David McCullough's book, right? Is that the last? And then Edmund Morris's first book in his trilogy. And I remember reading that book when I was young and just being so fired up because it's about Roosevelt leaving the East behind, moving to the Badlands, and suddenly, recreating his life as a Westerner and it's very romantic and maybe a little bit over the top. But man, I'll tell you one thing, it's contagious. You read that stuff and you suddenly want to do a lot of work and you want to do great things. And
yeah, I understand that. I get that. How do you define the American West, which you write about and explore in your life and in this book? And how well is it represented in fiction and in folklore and American history? Because a lot of what we think, you have a really interesting passage about cowboys, and so we have all these. I think there's a lot that's been made of America. This idea of American exceptionalism was never really true. We were told that story, and this idea of what is the West that wasn't true or it wasn't accurate. How do you define it all?
That's a big question, and I would defer to my elder, Mr. Stegner, Wallace Stegner, who wrote about the geography of hope and who just brilliantly talked about how regional we remain as a country. And part of the reason the West is, and Westerners are different, is because of the physical place. Still now, even in this crowded world, the spaces are more vast. Still now, people are more likely to be outside in the physical world. Dryness, water, we're seeing more and more. The Colorado itself, which is the lifeblood, the Colorado River itself, the lifeblood of so much of the West. Something as simple, I wrote about this in my book about Stegner and Abbey, as the fact that as the climate warms, snowpack, which was great in terms of the arid West because it was time release. If you have snowpack high in the mountains, you get some water, then a few weeks later you get more water, and rainfall as it warms isn't the same. It comes roiling down the side, taking the erosion. So Stegner thought about the West psychologically, literarily, and physically in such a brilliant way that I started to pick up when I moved west when I was 30. Not only was I was really into getting physically fit because I'd just been really sick before that.
Right.
And I was hiking a ton and I was getting out, but I was also reading the West. And Ed Abbey and Wallace Stegner kind of gave me an entry into that. So when I moved back east, I feel like I brought Stegner with me. And by that, I mean the way to see a region in terms of its physical characteristics and its almost like a human, its psychological characteristics. And so, again, I didn't answer your question.
Well, I have a different question based on what you just said, which is in going back to the book, you write about Teddy Roosevelt's curiosity, and you write about how when he was on horseback and riding into I guess it's the Grand Canyon area, he's looking and he's pointing at all the birds and he's naming what kind of birds they are. And what it made me think is that he probably would read about a place and what had been written about the place before he visited the place. Yes. And I've started to do that a little bit in my older age, but I sometimes get embarrassed that I haven't appreciated certain basic fundamental things about life, like the sunset, sunrise, and other weather conditions, not to mention all different kinds of species of nature, birds, insects, and so on. And I wonder what that's about. Like, where are we in human development or I don't know what culture, if you wanted to define that, you could spend most of your life in a certain place or even a long period of time living in a place and not recognize hardly any of your natural surroundings. Yeah. What is that? What's that called? What does that mean for us as a species?
To turn it into a form of advice, I would say you can't be afraid to be an idiot when it comes to learning your place. You can't be afraid to ask the most basic questions. Again, those are pictures of ospreys behind me. And when I started, the first book I got an advance for. And they said, we want you to write about birds. You write about birds well. Okay. I don't want to write about a little semi-palmated plover or a little fluttery bird. I want to write about something big that dives into the water. So I said, I'll write about ospreys, because when I lived on Cape Cod as a kid, they'd been wiped out by DDT. There were no ospreys. And now they were coming back. Wow. And I was coming back from cancer, and it seemed like, metaphorically, it seemed great as a theme.
Lovely.
But I didn't really know the birds. So when I first saw them, I'd be, look at that osprey, and it was a seagull, and I didn't see. So in other words, diving in, and a lot of times I'd be with great birders who would go like, oh, look at the third pectoral. But diving in and not being afraid to be dumb. And I always say, by the end of a year and a half of going out in the marsh and studying them and learning and asking questions and talking to experts, if a giant osprey meteor had been hurtling toward Earth and Bruce Willis got 5 people together to fight, they would have brought me as the lay osprey person, because so it's that John Muir quote. It's like, if you get obsessed with so a way into something, for instance, during the pandemic, a lot of people have talked about starting to finally get to know their backyards or their immediate area. What a great way to know every place is to know one place, to like really dig into, sometimes literally dig into the place where you live. Ask, if you went out and learned one thing a day, like one, what is this tree that's been in my backyard 20 yards from my window that I've never really looked at? I mean, it's just amazing how it sounds kind of boring at first, and it's so exciting ultimately to kind of
I have a weed that I despise because it takes everything over, and when you pull it, it has a fragrance that it's pungent, and I don't like it, David. I don't like it at all. And I realized the other day, I was like, I don't know anything about that weed. I guarantee there's a lot documented about it because it smells and it spreads. And it was one of those moments where I realized, geez, this thing that's kind of like really been a dilemma for me for the past few years, certainly for my rose bushes, which I try to manicure at least a little bit, or if I'm being honest, my mom does.
Well, when we started, we were talking about the writing shack, and a weird thing, I mentioned that during Florence, I had 5 feet of water in there. It got wiped out. It all but floated out to sea.
That's because it's on the creek, right? And the creek bed rises.
Yeah. So it collapsed eventually. So I just started rebuilding it last January. And weirdly, I was reading this great biography by Laura Walls about Thoreau, or Thoreau as I'm supposed to pronounce him.
Oh, is that right?
I'm bad about it. It always sounded kind of pretentious to me, but that's how he pronounced it. So I might as well. Anyway, so I was reading Thoreau, and I was rebuilding the writing shack. And then when the pandemic hit, I felt like I'd been cheating for a test that everybody was going to have to take. I had my own place to shelter in. I just built it. And, and I was thinking Thoreauvian thoughts about, which is really about, he said, one of his famous lines is, I have traveled a good deal in Concord, his hometown. So he'd learned his place. And that's such a central lesson of nature writing. Writers like Wendell Berry, who really get to root down and know where they're from, and then can kind of imagine outward to the larger world.
I have an experience that I wanted to share with you during our conversation today that I would like for you to examine. I hadn't shared it yet anywhere. I was waiting to talk to you, and if you would indulge me.
Sure.
I think it's a red-shouldered hawk that lives in the woods behind my home, and I think they've learned a little bit they go back to the same nest every year. So it's high up in this tree. And I don't know if it's the same exact bird or if it's the family. I don't know. But every year, a red-shouldered hawk definitely uses that nest. And so every year I hear it circling and I hear its call. And I often, from in the random time, I'll catch it landing and I'll get out there with the binoculars and I'll look at it for as long as it'll allow, or it'll stay in one place. Last, maybe 2 weeks ago, I was out in my backyard and clearing an area for my new shed as I'm building the shed studio. I still need a garden shed.
The shedio.
And the shedio. Yep. And there I am trying to just clear a little space for the new place. And that hawk, David, lands on the ground right next to me about 8 feet away. I'm sure it had something to do with I'd just moved the compost bin and the horrific smell that was coming from it probably attracted it. But it landed right there on the ground. And its talons dug at the ground, and it kept pecking its head up and down and looking at me and that pattern over and over and looking at me. And I just sat there and I stared at it. This was the hawk that I'd been watching from a distance for years, now was landing right next to me. I hadn't shared that with anybody. I don't know what it means, but I do know that I didn't want it to end and that it was, in a way, it was just like, you're here. We're so close. I've been spying on you. What is that? What should I make of it, if anything?
I would call it a moment. And my whole birth as a so-called nature writer is built out of those moments that are just like, when, you weren't at that moment thinking about some neurotic thing in your brain. You were, the hawk was saying to you, build here, build here.
All right.
And I think that for me, before I knew anything, before I knew the names of anything, I remember mountain biking back when mountain biking started and going down in Mendocino down a road where a red-tailed hawk suddenly flew in parallel to me and we went downhill together for a while.
That's awesome.
And it was
That's
just like,
awesome.
Whoa, this is, I didn't have any philosophical thought about it other than, as Thoreau said when he hiked up Katahdin, contact. That's that idea of physical contact beyond yourself, and that is exactly what I get out of those moments. And of course, we were just talking about the building of these homes, and the nesting metaphor is so strong. I wrote about that a lot with the ospreys. To go to the home of the animal is just so exciting. And speaking of, on a sad note, the red-tailed hawks right across from my writing shack lost their home 2 days ago during the hurricane. And they were just all circling around, screeching yesterday. So, so it's on so many levels, going to nature. It's the physical thing, the contact. It's the commonality between humans and animals. And then the metaphoric, we take and we think, how does that apply to me? So, which is kind of the opposite of the biocentric way of thinking.
Before I let you go, and I really don't want to, but we've been chatting for almost an hour, and I'm sure you have plenty of other things to do and people to talk about, or talk to, especially about your new book, which I'm really enjoying. I wonder how you would describe the moment that we're in and how it's inspired you as a writer and a thinker, because, a lot of the pandemic needs to be looked at just in terms of we're a species. Yeah. Human species, and as a result of our consumption and our creation and our pollution and so on, this virus is existing in us because it came from this wet market. Yeah. So we can talk about factory farming, we can talk about climate change and economics and capitalism, whatever we want, but in healthcare. But how do you see this moment that we're in, how we got here, and what, if anything, comes of what can only be described, if you had to succinctly, as a disruption?
Yeah. Well, I would say it's a disruption within a disruption. And I always say that this book was born of Trump's election in a variety of ways, most obviously being when Ryan Zinke undeclared Bears Ears on October 27, 2017, and standing in front of a portrait of Teddy Roosevelt on Teddy Roosevelt's birthday. And I decided that so many people...
Trump's former Interior Secretary, Ryan Zinke.
Yeah. So many people and friends of mine and writers, you couldn't help. I mean, Trump's great talent is he's a sinkhole for attention, right? So you can't help but write about him. And often people were writing, he'd do something one day and they'd write the next. So this book, in a way, was my long rebuttal and response, from something I really care about, wilderness. And in a way, the lack of response or the ignoring of climate change has found an intensification within the pandemic itself. I wrote a piece about Thoreau early in the pandemic, and I was saying maybe these tools that are being suggested to us, not running around as much, staying still, learning close to home, leaving it as it is, maybe these tools that were effective in fighting the pandemic will also come in handy in the larger fight ahead against climate change, because they're exactly what we need to be doing. I'm not saying we're all, as we can see, we're a chaotic nation and doing different things. So for me, it is, I don't want to put a silver lining on it. I have sick friends and a mom in a nursing home, but for me, it has been an eye-opener personally, and as a country, in terms of what tools could be used going forward. And I don't know that we'll learn the lesson. As I said, I'm skeptical, if not cynical, about human nature and our ability to leave things as they are. But I think the lesson's there for us to see if we want to see it.
Well, for me, your work and this new book and this conversation has been a real eye-opener for me. Leave It As Is, A Journey Through Theodore Roosevelt's American Wilderness is the name of this book, but he is a New York Times bestselling author. He's written 10 others, including All the Wild That Remains. And what an honor to have a conversation with you. And I don't know if it's too much to ask for pictures of the shed that you ride in. I mean, and I would like to really get into the nitty gritty. I want interior photos if that's not too personal. And I'm fascinated by it. I really, as I am by all of your work, the space that you do it in. Thank you so much for your time today. It was a real pleasure.
Let's talk again sometime in the future. I had a lot of fun.
Could we be friends?
Oh, we'll try. I can take you out into nature, and when I finally get to move again.
You don't mind if I wear like a Fred Flintstone like unitard? Is that cool with you?
You can
Carry
wear
a club.
Yosemite Sam t-shirt.
Mustache. Thank you, sir.
Right, see ya. Thank you.
All right, there he goes. New guest. First time I've ever talked to him, David Gessner. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you'll get his book, all of his books. Fascinating guy, interesting guy, and I'm so glad that I had the opportunity to talk to him, and I really appreciate you listening to it. Again, thanks to all of you who joined me in the Zoom Hangout. My phone is buzzing right now with texts and emails and messages from you. If you're not a Patreon subscriber, please consider it. I put the podcast out every day. I cannot do it without your subscriptions because this is my job. This is what I'm doing now. And I've got great guests every single day, putting them together every single day, but I need your support. So if you haven't signed up yet, as little as $5 will go a long way. We got to get to 3,000 subscribers. We're almost to 700, and we've been doing this for a little over, I think, 7 months. Anyway, that's it. And I hope to see you on Saturday night if you're anywhere around Philadelphia. I'll be in Royersford, Pennsylvania, doing stand-up at 8 o'clock on Saturday night. Looking forward to meeting. I know a handful of listeners are definitely coming out already. Looking forward to seeing you guys and anybody else that hasn't told me they're coming. But always fun. It'll be my first time doing stand-up since the quarantine and pandemic began. Looking forward to it, and looking forward to meeting you there if you're coming out. So thank you very much for your support. I hope you have a great weekend if you're listening to this on Friday, and I will talk to you on Monday. I'm excited. I got a whole bunch of guests already booked for next week, so I'm very excited about learning and living and laughing with you through this craziness that we are going through together. You're not alone. I'm here. I'm with you. I love you, and I'll talk to you on Monday.